Bunch, Director of the Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture, with Margaret Carlson.
Hi. Let me first say I'm not Helene Cooper. She's the Pentagon correspondent for the New York Times, so she's busy covering the strikes in Syria. I took off the scarf, so maybe you wouldn't notice, but I'm back. And with the pleasure of being here with Lonnie Bunch, who's directing the newest museum in Washington, and the only new one on the Mall. And the architecture, the building itself is spectacular. Congratulations on that.
Thank you.
Because you had a lot of people. It wasn't easy getting to this point. I mean, there were a lot of people who didn't want the museum. They didn't want it on the Mall. They said it could never be done. You were lured here from Chicago, where you were perfectly happy in 2005. So tell me about your happiness since being here fighting to get that museum done.
Well, as I tell people, at 8 o'clock in the morning, I have the best job in America. And at 2 o'clock in the morning, it's the dumbest thing I've ever done in my life. In some ways, Chicago really nurtured my soul because there are very few African Americans that get to run major museums. But coming back here, building a museum that's been 100 years in the making, nurtured the soul of all my ancestors, so I knew I had to come back.
Well, that's an excellent way to put it. Getting it done was almost as hard as the 9/11 museum. A lot of politics involved. How did you work your way through that?
With a lot of luck. I think the reality is that we came up with a vision that said this is not an African American museum for African Americans, but that in essence this is the way for all Americans to better understand who they are, to understand their national identity. And the notion of making it inclusive made it easier to get corporate support, to get Congress involved. But I have to be honest, there were so many steps along the way where I had to go up on the hill and make sure people understood. But the reality is we are now a year away from opening this museum.
Amazing, yes. So I had a quick education about the new museum, and you're going to have, famous African Americans. You're going to have people who come in to see Jackie Robinson, and they're going to really rock and roll with Chuck Berry. Right. And there's a candy apple red Cadillac. It's just fantastic. But they're going to see some really sad things. And like the Holocaust Museum is a sad place. There's going to be sadness at the African American Museum.
There is no doubt that you will come into this museum and you will maybe cry as you ponder the pain of slavery and segregation. But the other side is to show the tension that comes from the joy within this community. So we expect people to say, this is not a place of sadness. It's a place of possibility, of resilience. It's a place that really speaks to the better angels of America.
And just one more thing about when you go to the Holocaust Museum, it was Hitler and it was Germans doing bad things to Jews, and this is Americans doing bad things to other Americans, which makes it, I think, a higher hurdle for visitors and for you.
Oh, absolutely. The notion of Americans as bad guys is really something we're not comfortable with.
It's hard to sell.
Right, it really is. And so part of the notion is to look at this and say, I have confidence in Americans' ability to look at themselves, to look at their country as a work in progress, and to recognize that there have been horrible moments, but there have also been moments where people have crossed racial lines, have blurred boundaries, and worked to make America live up to its stated ideals.
So you had a stunning achievement. You found the only slave ship that carried slaves. Half of them were lost, half of them survived, and you brought it to the museum. How did you find it? How did you get it here?
Well, the notion was that as I began to think about what this museum should be, I realized that even if we made it the most technologically sophisticated museum, it would fail, because at the Smithsonian, you go to see the Greensboro lunch counter or the Wright Flyer. So I thought, what is it that people haven't seen? And I thought, a slave ship. So I thought it was going to be pretty easy to find a slave ship. I didn't realize that almost every slave ship was on the ocean floor.
Totally gone, yes.
So we had to create a project with scholars from around the world to map the ocean floor And we thought we had a slave ship that went to Cuba. Oh, I can tell you for hours about negotiating with the Castros about getting the slave ships in Cuba. But the reality was that we found one through scholars that left Mozambique in 1794, was on its way to Brazil with 412 people, and sank off the coast of Cape Town. And as a result of research and diving, we actually found it. And what we did is we realized that I didn't want to bring up an entire ship because it's in pieces. I just wanted to have a few almost religious-like relics that would allow people to not think of the slave trade as something where 15 or 20 million people were involved, but the slave trade was also something I wanted to humanize, to say, here were 400 people touched by this. So my goal was to humanize history and make it accessible to people.
You had a similar experience. You were having a hard time finding, authors and a lot of artifacts from different periods of time. And Harriet Tubman was a very difficult one. How did you find her treasure?
Well, the biggest challenge of this museum was not raising money, not hiring staff, not even getting a space on the mall.
Tell candidates that. Not raising money?
Piece of cake.
You had an easy time of it?
Let's just say now I can say it's an easy time. But the reality is that I was more worried about the fact that we didn't have artifacts. Because unlike any other national museum in the world, this one didn't have a collection, it didn't have staff, it didn't have a benefactor. It had to start from scratch. So that's what I worried about. So we went around the country with the assumption that almost all of the 20th century and most of the 19th century is still in basements, trunks, and attics. So we went around the country trying to get people to basically, we stole the idea from Antique Roadshow, bring out your stuff, share it with the Smithsonian. But what happened is that I got a call after doing that from a collector in Philadelphia, and he said, Lonnie, I have material of Harriet Tubman. And I'm a 19th century historian.
How did he know?
Well, we had gone out, people had heard about us looking for things in the newspapers, and he knew me over the years. And when he called, I said, come on, you don't have anything on Harriet Tubman. Nobody does. And he said, why don't you come to Philadelphia and see? So I thought, well, at least I'll get a Philadelphia cheesesteak out of the deal, so I'll go. And I went up, and he took us into this room in Temple University, and he started pulling out things that I didn't know existed. He pulled out pictures of Harriet Tubman's funeral that no one had ever seen. He pulled out a sort of shawl that Harriet Tubman was wrapped in 3 days before she dies, a famous picture of that shawl, and there it was in front of me, given to Harriet Tubman by Queen Victoria.
Oh, my.
Then he pulled out this hymnal that had all those spirituals that Harriet Tubman used to sing when she'd go into the South to help the enslaved steal away. She'd sing, "Steal Away, Jesus," or "Swing Low, Sweet Chariot," and there in front of us was her personal hymnal. Well, by this time, everybody's crying.
Yeah.
And
you didn't care about the cheesesteak anymore.
Forget it. I just wanted the hymnal. And the collector said, I will give this to the Smithsonian because the public needs to see that. And that's been the joy of this process.
He gave it to you while he's still alive?
Oh, I wouldn't let him go anywhere without it. He was going to give it to me.
You're very persuasive.
I'm from New Jersey. I put the arm around.
Yeah. And he's just a kid in Philadelphia.
That's right.
He didn't know what hit him.
He really didn't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, congratulations on that one. So there's another exhibit we have a picture of, which is it IRA Aldridge?
Aldridge.
I don't think anybody outside of, a historian like you has heard of IRA Aldridge.
Well, part of what we want to do is introduce the public to stories they think they know in new ways, but also find stories that are really important. And IRA Aldridge is an amazing story. This is somebody who was born a free black man in New York City in 1807 and fell in love with the theater and wanted to become an actor and loved the notion of a Shakespearean actor. He couldn't get any opportunities in the United States, so he left at age 20 to go to England. And he began to work as an actor, and he was so good that he became the first African-American to play Othello in a mixed-race production. And he became the toast of Europe for 20 or 30 years. And he never got back to America. He always wanted to come, and no one would bring him back. And but he felt that he was still an American, so all the money he raised, he gave a lot of it back to abolitionist organizations to help his enslaved brethren. And just before he thought he could come back to America, unfortunately, he died in 1867. And so what we have is this playbill that sort of announces his performance as Othello in a theater in the UK. And very rarely do you get the chance to do things like that.
No, rarely. So do you have an Obama exhibit at the museum?
Well, we have, of course we do.
I guess it was a dumb question.
I may be from Jersey, but I am smart.
Yeah. Well, I'm from Washington, and I'm not.
I think what we realized is that the election of Obama was a historic moment. And so we thought it was crucially important to tell the story of the election. And what we actually did, we actually went and collected an entire campaign headquarters of Obama that he had in Northern Virginia. So in a way, the goal was not necessarily to simply celebrate President Obama, but to talk about what this means as we enter into the early days of the 21st century. And so that's what we've been trying to do, because for me, the goal of this museum is, on the one hand, this will be the first green museum on the Mall, and that's great. I'm really proud of that. And it's going to have artifacts that people have never imagined they can see. But the goal of the museum is to help people realize that history is as much about today and tomorrow as it is about yesterday. And that ultimately the job of a National Museum of the Smithsonian is to make America better.
Well, that's a good goal, because many museums stop, hard at some place. And
about 1952.
Yeah, something like that. So you don't always, you don't get the up-to-date. So what surprised you? What are you including that you wouldn't have thought of before? What are you proudest of?
Well, I really think that I'm proudest of the things that average people have shared with us. One day a woman came into my office and said her grandfather had been a black soldier in World War I, and she had stuff. And she dumped this bag on my table. And as I looked at this stuff, it turned out her grandfather was a black soldier in World War I who fought for the 369th, which is the Harlem Hellfighters, a famous unit. But the U.S. government didn't know how to use them, so they gave them to the French. So they initially fought in French uniforms. And they were so good, they had the French version of the Medal of Honor, the Croix de Guerre. There on my table was his Croix de Guerre from 1919.
Wow.
That's what makes us so powerful.
Some people found you.
People realize in some ways they've been waiting for this. It's both the sort of trust of the Smithsonian, but the recognition that the story of the African American had really been left out of so much. And to be able to now reach into their basements, share the stories of their families, makes it very special and in some ways very humbling for us.
Yeah. Do you ever cry?
All the time.
Because you're making me cry a little bit.
With monotonous regularity.
You and John Boehner.
That's right.
You could be Speaker of the House.
Okay. I'll stick to being a museum director.
So you arrived here in 2005. You've done what many people thought wasn't going to happen in a decade. And you open when
we hope to open by the end of September a year from now.
Okay, so this is the anniversary of your opening.
It's been 10, I've never done anything for 10 years other than stay married. It's just been an amazing
Mrs. Bunch
day.
is thrilled, I'm sure. Yeah.
She'll be thrilled when we cut the ribbon.
Yes. So do you then, your child is born, do you stay another 10?
Well, you stay long enough to do two things. One, candidly, to take a little victory lap, write the book, do that. But also, no matter what we do, people are going to be critical. You talk too much about religion, not enough about religion. You didn't talk about this. So I want to stay around long enough to fight the fight.
Okay. Well, I hope I'm there, and congratulations.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thank you.
That was great.
That was fun.